All the elves are considered to be the children of Isha, the goddess and protector of the natural world and harmony. Her all-seeing eye is ever set on the world, watching over the elven race and nurturing them from above. It is to her that many pray for rich harvest and health, for she is the giver of life. Forbidden to meet them herself in the mortal planes by the will of Asuryan, her grace shines upon the seekers through the Everqueen, the most beloved of her offspring. Astarielle was the first of the Everqueens, endowed with light and strength so that she may guide her people through times of peace and turbulence alike. She held court in the oldest elven kingdom of ULTHUAN, the green region of Avalon. The Everqueen and her people walked through the celestial forests of this summerland as nomads, setting up silken tents at night and singing along the rivers in the day. At an unknown time, an ancient tree in the heart of a mainland forest began to stretch its roots out. This tree was the Oak of Ages, and the forest in which it belonged was like no other, for there was an ancient and powerful magic that seeped into the trunks and brought trees to life. For ages, the trees came to think, move, and feel all there was to feel. Anger and hate, friendship and compassion. As the reach of the Oak of Ages expanded across vast distances, the powerful spirits of the great forest were able to journey to foreign lands through the world roots. When the spirits first arrived in Avalon, they were met with awe of the near-immortal elves. Many of these newcomers warmed to the gentle folk of Avalon upon noticing their naive fascination with nature and their kindness towards the forest critters. With time, the spirits and the elves learned to live together in harmony as the seeds of trust and respect towards each other grew. One of such spirits, the wise DURTHU'S, or Oakheart as he was called by the elves, took a deep liking of these beings and trusted them with many secrets of the forest. Unbeknownst to anyone, his fondness of the elves, particularly of the Everqueen, would shape the future of both the Great Forest and of Astarielle's people in the forthcoming ages. Back in that golden age, the spirits danced above the skies and the elves beneath them, without the worry of war and death. Such serenity came to an abrupt and unexpected end after the polar gates collapsed and the chaos energies flowed freely into the world, twisting and corrupting everything. The legendary beings that originally shaped the world, called the Old Ones, abandoned everything they had built to its fate in the face of the coming doom. Chaos engulfed the world, and darkness spread far and wide, devouring life wherever it flourished. ULTHUAN was not spared from the terrible suffering the legions of demons had brought upon many young civilizations. Settlements burned, and many cities were burned to the ground. Men, dwarfs, orcs, and many other races alike suffered greatly at the hands of the newly arrived foe. But the demon hosts, above all else, craved the virtuous souls of the elves, and so they struck the island of ULTHUAN, and they did it vigorously. In the midst of the madness and destruction, many elven heroes arose to challenge and stop the new menace. Greatest of them all was Aenarion the Defender, a brave warrior who united the people to brave the chaos tides together and to stand in the way of annihilation that was deemed certain. he hurled himself at the flames of Asuryan in the hopes that his sacrifice would save his people from doom. The flames consumed him, but was then quickly healed and reborn, with the light of Asuryan now burning within his breast and a newfound power. Aenarion was declared the first of the Phoenix King by the Elves, and his crusade brought a halt to the Chaos invasion in ULTHUAN. In that time of restless calm, Aenarion married Astarielle, and they shared a short-lived bliss together. The king was deeply in love with the Everqueen, and his affection grew only stronger once she bore him precious offspring, Marelian and Ivrain. However, when their land fell into the grasp of chaos once more, Aenarion led his forces to battle again, while Astarielle took the younglings to the relative safety of Avalon. The Everqueen hoped for the forest to shield them from misery and death, but deep in her heart, she feared the strength of the spirits would not be enough, as this invasion was fiercer, and the number of demons was greater than the first Chaos incursion. The land of Avalon had remained untouched by the shadows since the beginning of the invasion, for the demons sensed the powerful energy of DURTHU'S and the spirits of the forest, and went for the easier prey first. Nonetheless, a tragic day arrived when Avalon could not be spared by the sheer presence of the spirits alone. Alas, with Aenarion and his army fighting far away, help was out of reach. As the flames swallowed the Summerland, the demons flowed into the forest with a great hunger for the souls awaiting them. The last sanctuary ULTHUAN held was breached, and with it, the temporary peace Astarielle had found for herself and her loved ones was over. Instead of leaving for the safety of the great forest, the spirits stood together with the elven warriors of Avalon, for they had seen the benefit of fighting together against this common and undeniably powerful enemy. Yet the nightmare they witnessed with their waking eyes was not to be stopped or slowed down. With every passing hour, more of the elves were slain in the forest that was no longer a home, but a burning graveyard. The demons were spreading like a disease, tainting the forest spirits and turning them mad as they fought, forever corrupting their souls. The few that survived were pushed further and further into the heart of the forest, surrounded with flames and nowhere to hide. As the heavens turned red and the sun began to set, Astarielle stood still before the wall of fire sizzling around them. With tears running down her face, the Everqueen turned to DURTHU'S and begged him to take Marelian and Ivrain away to safety through the world routes. She knew her last breath was nearing, yet if her daughter Ivrain died, the line of the Everqueen would come to an abrupt end. It was a grand favour to ask from the ancient spirit, for never before had the spirits carried blooded creatures through the roots of the Oak of Ages and into the heartland of Allarielle. Although DURTHU'S harboured much liking for the Everqueen, he wished not to act against the wishes of his own kind. His gaze turned upon the last of the elven warriors who were being cast down, and then to the spirits who had chosen to stay with their allies until the end. It was then DURTHU'S realized that, against the darkness that had arisen from the oblivion, there was no victory to be won by the spirits alone. If they were to last at all, it was only together, for in all those years living beside one another, both the spirits and the elves had grown wiser and stronger. At last, as the world around them crumbled away, the ancient DURTHU'S accepted Astarielle's desperate plea. However, if he was to carry the children to the relative safety of the Great Forest, there would be a price to pay. The forest would claim the elves to save the spirits and the trees in their time of need. There was neither time to waste nor chance for lengthy goodbyes, for a nefarious demon with curled horns crushed the last of Astarielle's warriors. This nightmarish being with 4 long arms was Nekari, the greatest slayer of the Chaos god Slaanesh, and the feaster of pain. Astarielle held Morellian and Yvraine for the last time and hurriedly gave them to the care of the Tree Lord. Now that her beloved ones were beyond the reach of this havoc, she had yet one last thing to do before being ripped away from the world of the living. The Everqueen calmly walked towards the colossal demon that dwarfed her and challenged it with all the powerful magic she possessed. A disheartened DURTHU kept his promise and left Avalon with the 2 young elves, who were put into a magical slumber to spare them from the terror unfolding all around them. All the better, DURTHU thought, for the sorrow they were to find once awake could wait. After the world roots carried them back to DURTHU'S home, he realized that in the centuries he was gone, the time had not stood still for the Great Forest either. The green blanket which had once clad nearly the entire world was now merely stretching between the shoulders of 2 mountain ranges. Scaled down as it was, but fortunately the forest was more or less preserved in the way it had always been. Keeping the violent wars and incursions at the borders of the years had taken its toll on some of the spirits though. Some of them were more bitter and violent than DURTHU remembered them to be. Initially he was reluctant to meet with the other elders, with a good reason too, for he feared he had disgraced the Oak of Ages and the culture of his own kind by bringing the 2 elves to their sacred forest. Lingering was of no use, so he presented Astarielle's offsprings to his fellow treemen, and awaited the consequences. The eldest and the wisest of them all, Adanu, was ever afraid of change, and felt offended by DURTHU'S disregard for their ancient customs. The hostile and fierce Kodal, on the other hand, seemed to be rather furious with the sheer presence of the blooded creatures in their home. At long last, following much bickering, Adanu allowed the elves to stay in DURTHU'S safekeeping, but only if they were kept in their slumber. Not that the wise Tree Lord was wholly convinced, yet the times were changing, and if they were not to change along, the forest would surely perish. Perhaps the forest would one day need the elves, as much as Astarielle's offspring needed them now. And perhaps it was DURTHU'S bargain that would forestall the terrible fate Adanu deeply feared. So did Morellian and Yvraine sleep under the canopy of trees, with the ever-watchful eyes of DURTHU upon them. Back in ULTHUAN, Aenarion was given the news of his wife's passing, and believed their offsprings to be dead too, as they were nowhere to be found. Grief and pain consumed him, filling his mind with vengeance only and hardening his heart. The pain was much to bear, and he eventually reached for the altar of Cain, the Elven god of war, where the sword of Cain rested. He grabbed this powerful sword, unleashing unimaginable power, but also tainting him. The elves banished the Chaos invasion once again, but the price had been very high. The act of grabbing the sword of Cain, without him fully knowing, had set the stones for yet more turbulent times for his people in the future. In time, Avalon was rid of the immediate danger, and the life began anew for the elves. Once the time was right, DURTHU carried the two elves back to ULTHUAN and left them in Gaean Vale to be found by their people. When they finally awoke from their long slumber, they remembered nothing of their time in the great forests. All they knew was the last embrace of their mother before they were saved by DURTHU. Yvraine later fulfilled her destiny as the spiritual guide of her people, while Morelion stayed beside her sister to protect her from any harm. Never again did they meet DURTHU, but it mattered not. The spirit had kept his promise to the late Everqueen, and although he wished to help rebuild Avalon, he knew the great forest needed him more. Guiding the other spirits that were still in Avalon, DURTHU journeyed back home through the world routes once more. This was not the last time the spirits were in the company of the elves, though. The bargain the Everqueen and DURTHU had made intertwined the fates of the elves and the spirits forever, and they would need each other again before their time in the mortal planes was over. Many thousands of years after Astarielle's passing, the darkness and havoc of chaos returned to ULTHUAN in a vengeful fury. The Everqueen at the time felt the coming tribulations for her people, while a faceless fear nested in her heart. Yet she found a peace of serenity, knowing that her daughter was well hidden and the lineage of the Everqueen was protected with her. As the Elven tradition demanded, the Everqueen in line, a golden-headed maiden named Allarielle, had been taken away from her mother to be raised in secrecy. Allarielle, still young in Elven years, had yet many ages ahead of her to learn and grow into the spiritual leader she was destined to become. However, as each passing day turned more worrisome than the last, the once faint whisper of a great war grew only louder. Soon it was obvious that Allarielle's time as the next Everqueen would arrive quicker than anyone anticipated, and her crowning would coincide with the beginning of a terrible invasion, the likes of which were not seen since the turbulent times of the Sundering, when the Druchii were separated from their kin, marking the perpetuation of the ongoing rivalry between the Dark Elves and the High Elves. As the scheme of the Chaos Gods finally unveiled by the gathering of an enormous army of destruction, the Witch King knew his patiently awaited time had come. Malekith sent his deadliest champion to ULTHUAN, and entrusted him with infiltrating the High Elf Society under the false identity of a noble prince. Cruel beyond comprehension, and famed for his superior skills, the assassin Urian Poisonblade was the embodiment of death itself. His cunning and manipulative ways enabled him to gain the trust of many important figures of the High Elf Society against all odds. Although Urian secretly came to enjoy his prestigious life among the trusting High Elves, he knew it had to end. The Dark Elf said his farewells to his carefree life in ULTHUAN in silence, and poisoned the Everqueen in cold blood. A foul and malevolent act. The murder of the Everqueen was to rip out the heart of the Elven nation and cut off their life force. Without her, the elves would fall into despair and become vulnerable, posing less of a threat to the domination of dark forces. As the shock and sorrow spread, the coming doom upon the world dawned even on the most ignorant. Death was coming for the living. Chaos was finally unleashed. The entire world was facing the threat of the numerous armies of the ruinous powers that had been moving south from the Chaos Wastes. Following the ever-chosen of Chaos, hundreds of thousands of wretched followers were marching towards the Empire to strike at the heart of the world of man. Drums of war sounded across all lands and provinces of the old world. Simultaneously in ULTHUAN, and led by the Witch King himself, the Dark Elves were joined by a plague fleet of Nurgle, and set sail to the island to get rid of the High Elves once and for all. Through an unholy alliance, the Dark Elves were bolstered by tribes of Chaos Marauders and Warriors of Chaos. Malekith and his Chaos allies sank many ships of ULTHUAN's navy out into the wild seas. Soon the Dark Army successfully invaded the Blighted Isles and took back Naggareth. At last, Malekith had set foot upon his birthlands and sent his troops on a rampage upon the usurpers who banished them many thousand years ago. Allarielle's crowning as the new Everqueen came to pass exactly at this terrible time. With her mother murdered in cold blood at the hands of the assassin Urien Poisonblade, and her people on the brink of eradication, the young Everqueen was suddenly given the heavy burden of saving the Elves against the overwhelming odds. It was now she who was to guide their nation and rekindle hope that had grown so weak in their land. Within her, Allarielle carried the power of nature and light, yet the source of life she was given was dependent on the fate of the world. The stronger Chaos Gods became, the more her strength waned. The Witch King knew the Everqueen had to be annihilated to ensure his ultimate domination of ULTHUAN. The armies of the Dark Elves and the hordes of Chaos creatures burned and pillaged Avalon in search for the Everqueen, leaving a trail of death and blood-stained lands behind them. When the encampment of Allarielle was finally found in the depths of the ancient forest, Prince Tyrion, the descendant of Aenarion and the most famed warrior of their age, was at the Queen's court. In a hurried frenzy, the maiden guard of the Everqueen gathered and clashed with their attackers, fighting fiercely to protect the Everqueen. In desperation, Tyrion quickly dragged the Everqueen out of her pavilion and cleared them a path of escape through the Dark Elf forces with all his might. Although his desperate plan was successful, Tyrion was badly wounded by the cursed blade of a witch elf. As the pair disappeared behind the thick cover of the forest, a long chase began. The rumors claimed Tyrion and Allarielle dead, yet the Witch King was determined to see the end of Isha's lineage, and he was most certainly not meaning to leave it to chance. The Witch King summoned 4 master assassins and tasked them with finding the remains of the Everqueen. His intention was to hang her body upon his banner as the army marched towards the Elven kingdoms. He would display the Everqueen's ruined body to her people and let hope give way to desperation and fear. While the rest of ULTHUAN was buried in grief upon hearing the supposed death of Allarielle and Tyrion, one elf refused to believe their passing. Teclis, the twin brother of Tyrion and the sorcerer of the White Tower, felt certain that his brother was alive and within his reach. The invisible thread that bound them since the day of their birth was yet unbroken, so there was still hope. As he prepared for his departure from the White Tower to seek Tyrion, he was gifted the War Crown of Sapphire by the High Lawmaster of the High Elves to aid him in his coming quest. The pair's tracks were being followed by the assassins through the forest, and at last, the hunters were led right to the Everqueen. As the Dark Elves burst through the branches, Tyrion jumped to his feet to fight them. His wound had weakened him, and a long chase had worn him out, yet Tyrion charged at their pursuers with firm determination. The Elven warrior cut them down one by one, but unfortunately, not before the last of them sent a message to Malekith of their discovery. The Witch King was beyond pleased upon hearing the conditions in which the fugitives were hiding. Trapped within the burning forests of Avalon and the armies of chaos, the pair had nowhere to go. Malekith summoned the greater demon Nakari and sent him to hunt down the Everqueen. The Keeper of Secrets was eager for the chase, for he remembered the taste of such a high-being soul from the last time. Back in the forest, Tyrion was feverish and drained of his strength as the poison from the witch's blade conquered more of his body. With the chaos getting stronger by each and every victory upon the Elven realm, Allarielle's magical powers were dwindling away, and healing the cursed wound was now beyond her capability. Too often, the searching enemies were closing in, and few were the places that could shelter Allarielle from her seekers. Eventually, and after many efforts from the Elves to stop the greater demon, Nakari finally found his prey in the forest. Tyrion was barely in the land of the living, yet he stood up to shield Allarielle one last time. It was the duty of any Elven hero, yet more than that, it was the call of his heart, for he had been more than the warden of the Everqueen for some time. Chaos was ascendant, and Nakari swiftly sent Tyrion flying across the forest floor. There was nothing between death and the Everqueen. She who kept the power of Isha within could banish such a demon from their world at the height of her strength. Yet the terrible shadow had covered the light for far too long, and Allarielle was exhausted. As she gave in and awaited the cold grasp of death, the sky was abruptly pierced by a lightning bolt above the demon. Confused and overwhelmed, Allarielle thought she saw Tyrion emerging from the shadows of the trees and coming in between her and the Chaos Monster once again. Yet it was not Tyrion, but Teclis, who, after having looked for the pair for weeks long, had finally located them. Although still young at the time, the mage's magic was so epic that it forecasted the legendary sorcerer he would soon come to be known across the world. Their clash was quite short-lived, since Teclis was at his fittest and was equipped with the enchanted powerful weapons from the White Tower. With a gigantic blast of energy, the demon was engulfed in blue flames and shot back to the Chaos Realms altogether. Allarielle and Teclis stood beside the badly hurt Tyrion as Teclis chanted a healing spell he had learned in the White Tower. Hanging at the edge of nothingness, Tyrion heard the voice of his brother calling out to him and followed it back to the light. After Allarielle and Tyrion gathered their strength, Teclis led them to the shores of the Inner Sea, where the survivors of the Queen's Guard awaited their coming. The white ship then swiftly sailed to the Muri FINUVAL plain of Safari, where the last battle of the Age of Vengeance was to be fought. Too long were the Elven warriors scattered across ULTHUAN, having to fight a guerrilla war against the crushing forces of Chaos and Naggaroth. The day had finally come for them to gather under one banner for their final stand. The fate of their race would be revealed in the open plains of the marshlands. With the Phoenix King's siege within Lothan, it was up to Allarielle to rally their people and give them the courage to fight against the dark. Seeing their Everqueen alive and having her presence amongst them spread a wave of unlikely joy through the ranks of the High Elves. The odds were greatly against them, yet it mattered not. The elves of all the kingdoms had journeyed across war-ridden, destroyed lands to fight and die, a glorious death right there in the battlefield. The battle turned into hell quickly as mayhem ensued, and the piles of dead bodies began to rise. At the center of the field, a reinvigorated Tyrion became a living legend. and a reflection of Aenarion himself, fighting the Dark Elves by the dozens, and killing them with swift blows and parrying incoming attacks, all while Teclis engaged in a great magic duel against the black art of the Witch King himself. Thousands of chaos demons, ravenous for the elven souls, crossed to the mortal world and filled up the atmosphere. With the coming of the demons, the High Elves were set to die there, eventually being overwhelmed against almost impossible odds. Allarielle collected all her power and set off an enormous wave of bright light that travelled across the field, banishing hordes of chaos demons from the mortal planes back again into the warp. With the strong magic she had spent, Allarielle's energy was diminished. Queen's handmaiden swiftly carried her unconscious body away from the havoc to safety, where she could be nursed back to health. With many of the demons cast away, Teclis could focus his fight almost solely on the Witch King. With the blessing given to him by Lilith, he eventually managed to banish Malekith and turn the tide against Chaos and the Dark Elves. It was also during this battle that the death of the previous Everqueen was avenged. The arrogant Urian Poisonblade, ever so oblivious to his own flaws, challenged Tyrion to a duel that lasted for an entire hour. Their skills were almost matched, and it seemed impossible for any one of them to gain the upper hand. At the end, it was Tyrion who struck down the Dark Elf with a well-placed attack and sent him to the world of the dead. After this significant battle that ended with victory for the High Elves, Allarielle the Radiant rode to many more battles where she was needed across ULTHUAN. Although cherished by the masses, much of her people dissented her active role in the army, which traditionally was that of the Phoenix King. The Everqueen was to be the spiritual leader of their race, the peaceful and the gracious one, who steered away from violence and war. However, with the Phoenix King FINUVAL locked into his tower following a mysterious agenda, Allarielle had little choice but to take his place. She was a caring and gentle spirit as an Everqueen, but also fierce and wild as a warrior who did not hesitate to condemn the corrupted. This undeniably combative side of hers was interpreted as a sign that the goddess Isha herself was turning more warlike. Whether her actions were traditional or not, one thing is for certain. As long as Allarielle the Everqueen breathes life, she will be a nightmare to all who mean harm to the Elven realms.